I'm Kareem Khalifa, and today's lesson is Validity and Soundness. Today's discussion will highlight three concepts, the first of which is the concept of an argument. Second, we'll look at validity, the most important concept in the whole course. Third, we'll look at a very closely related concept, soundness. First, let's talk about arguments. I want to begin by indicating two senses of argument that won't be the topic of discussion for today. Probably the most common use of the word argument in English is as a kind of disagreement, like the kind of argument you might have with your parents about how late you can stay out at night or something like that. That's not the sense of argument that we'll be discussing today. In a previous lecture, we talked about the argument of a predicate. This is basically a blank in a predicate that gets filled by an individual constant. That won't be what we're talking about today either. So what exactly will we be talking about today? We'll be talking about arguments as inferences, that is, arguments as items of reasoning. Let's unpack this a little bit. When we think of arguments as inferences, here's a rough and ready definition of what we mean. An argument is a set of statements such that one member of that set, the conclusion, is affirmed on the basis of the others, the premises. Here's an example. If you've aced all your homework, you'll pass this course. You've aced all your homework, so you'll pass this course. Note that this is a set of statements. Now let's see how conclusions and premises function in it. The last statement is the conclusion. It's affirmed on the basis of the other two statements. The remaining two statements are premises. They're basically the thing that are supporting or backing up or establishing the conclusion. So how do we go about identifying premises and conclusions in ordinary English passages? There are certain words in English that tip you off that what you're about to read is a premise. These are called premise indicators. You might want to pause this slide for a moment and just copy these down. Similarly, there are words in English that tip you off that what you're about to read is a conclusion. These are called conclusion indicators. As before, it might be worth pausing the video and jotting these down. Importantly, looking for premise and conclusion indicators is not a fail-safe device for identifying argument structure. Let's walk through an example. Since I woke up, I've worked out, drank coffee, and then finally prepared my lecture. In many contexts, since and then are premise and conclusion indicators, respectively, but not in this case. In this case, they're just marking temporal order, so there's no argument here to speak of. If you look, right, it's not that preparing my lecture is affirmed on the basis of waking up, working out, drinking coffee, etc., in the same way that we saw with the previous example. Right? This is just sort of saying one damn thing happened after another. Right? So the general lesson here is you can't just haphazardly and mindlessly look for premise and conclusion indicators. You've got to think about what you're reading. Here's an example of an argument with no premise or conclusion indicators, but you can just once again think about what you're reading and you can see it's an argument. I checked to see if the door was locked before I left. You have nothing to worry about. Very clearly, the second statement is being affirmed on the basis of the first. It's an argument. Remember, in first-order logic, we're trying to make things as unambiguous as possible. As such, we're not going to have sort of haphazard or numerous premise and conclusion indicators. We're going to have a very stable convention for identifying what are the premises in an argument and what's the conclusion. Specifically, in first-order logic, we use what are called Fitch bars. A Fitch bar looks like a sideways T. The vertical line basically tells you all of the statements that are in the argument, and then the horizontal line is structured such that everything above it is a premise and everything below it is a conclusion. Okay, so we now know what an argument is. But remember, the main goal of this course is to figure out when we have good and bad arguments, what we called good and bad reasoning not so long ago. So we're primarily focused on that arrow in between the premises and the conclusion when we talk about this. This is the notion of validity. And as I said, this is the most important concept in the class. Intuitively, premises are supposed to support or back up or establish the conclusion. The notion of validity is supposed to render these ideas a bit more precise. What do we mean exactly by support or back up or establish? And it's at least one way in which we talk about reasoning being good or bad, is that basically the premises have to support or back up or establish in the right sorts of ways. Maybe an even better way to think about this is that the conclusion follows from the premises. Let's try to unpack this. Validity is sometimes called logical consequence. We'll use these interchangeably. But here's the official definition. An argument is valid if and only if there is no possible way for all of its premises to be true when its conclusion is false. I repeat, this is the single most important concept in the class. This is the single most important concept in the class. You with me? Okay, let's walk through an example to see how this works. Let's start with an example of a valid argument, and then we'll contrast it with an example of an invalid argument. So here's our valid argument. All mammals are warm-blooded. Khalifa is a mammal, therefore Khalifa is warm-blooded. Hopefully that just kind of feels valid. You can kind of feel the conclusion following immediately from the premises. At any rate, let's walk through the definition with this example in mind. Let's try to understand this in a piecemeal fashion. What we want to do is sort of understand what happens when the conclusion is false. You can think of this as a sort of hypothetical scenario. So we assume in this particular case that I'm not warm-blooded. Think of this like a Venn diagram where on the left are the set of warm-blooded things, and I'm outside of that set. Okay, so if we're following the definition, then what we're going to try and figure out is whether it's possible now to make both of the premises true when the conclusion is false. We see it's not too hard to have the first premise be true and the conclusion false at the same time. Right? So all mammals are warm-blooded, and then we imagine that I'm outside of the set of warm-blooded things, which also includes mammals. Note that the definition of validity requires all of the premises to be true when the conclusion is false. And we can't have both the first premise be true and the conclusion be false and have the second premise be true as well. I'm not going to be a mammal if all mammals are warm-blooded and I'm not warm-blooded. Here's another way to see it. Suppose that we made all of the premises true. Then there's going to be a contradiction because I'm going to have to be both warm-blooded and not warm-blooded at exactly the same time. So the argument's valid. You might say to yourself, wait a second, is it really possible for Khalifa to be cold-blooded? And the answer is yes, but we just need to be precise about the notion of possibility that's in play when we're evaluating the validity of an argument. That notion of possibility is called logical possibility. It's simply the absence of contradiction. And you can see there's no contradiction in saying that Khalifa is cold-blooded. It's not like saying 2 plus 2 doesn't equal 4. There's an obvious contradiction. There are different notions of possibility that aren't at play in logic, and those would be things like biological possibility, and it's certainly not biologically possible for me to be cold-blooded, or perhaps it's not technologically possible for me to be cold-blooded, something like that. But those don't matter for logic. You get to be pretty imaginative when thinking of counterexamples to an argument. Okay, so now let's contrast this with an example of an invalid argument. That's one where the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises. So here's our example. Every cool kid is a Democrat. Biden is a Democrat. Therefore, Biden is a cool kid. Okay, so we're going to run this through exactly the same procedure that we did for the previous argument. So we start off trying to imagine what it would be like for Biden not to be a cool kid. Here we go. Okay, so you might be tempted to set this up exactly like the previous example, in which case you make the first premise true, and then try to see what you can do with the second premise. What we'll see is that it's quite different here, but here would be at least a first attempt. Problem is, this only shows that there's some possible way for some of the premises to be true when the conclusion is false. What we want to show is that there's no possible way for all of the premises to be true when the conclusion is false. And we see we don't get this. Here's the best way to think about it. Remember with our previous example that when we made all of the premises true, we ended up with a contradiction. I had to be both warm-blooded and not warm-blooded at the same time. Now let's look at the Biden example and see how that's different. When we make both of the premises true, on the Biden example, what we see is actually there's no contradiction at all. Right? It's not that Biden has to be both a Democrat and not a Democrat, or both a cool kid and not a cool kid. Right? He's just a Democrat who's not a cool kid, and that's consistent with the premises and a denial of the conclusion. In other words, there's some possible way for all of the argument's premises to be true when its conclusion is false. This is what we call an invalid argument. This is a case of bad reasoning. The conclusion doesn't follow from the premises. Okay, let's move to our third concept, soundness. Sound arguments have two properties. First, they're valid. Second, all of their premises are true. A consequence of these two features is that the conclusion of every sound argument is true. Think about it. An argument's valid just in case there's no possible way for all of its premises to be true when its conclusion is false. We then know that in sound arguments, all of the premises are true, so we know that there's no way for the conclusion to be false. While all sound arguments are valid, not all valid arguments are sound. Here's an example of an unsound but valid argument. Here's the example. All unicorns have one horn. Khalifa is a unicorn. Therefore, Khalifa has one horn. Now, clearly this is unsound. As much as I would like to be, I am not a unicorn. Nevertheless, the argument is valid. If we try to make all of the premises true when the conclusion is false, we end up with a contradiction. Basically, I'll end up being one-horned and not one-horned at the same time. So this was an unsound but valid argument in which some of the premises were false and the conclusion was false, but other kinds of unsound but valid arguments are possible too. I'll just briefly mention them. You can have unsound but valid arguments in which some of the premises are false and the conclusion is true. You can have unsound but valid arguments in which all of the premises are false and the conclusion is true. And finally, you can have what you might think of as the worst of all unsound but valid arguments. All of the premises are false and the conclusion is false. Now, I'm not going to give you examples of each of these, but this might be a good thing to post on the discussion board if you're stumped about any of these examples. Finally, I should say that we'll be focusing on the validity of arguments and not so much on the soundness of them. There's a lot of different ways of discussing this, a lot of different angles on this, but the standard party line from logicians is that logic alone can tell you if an argument's valid or invalid. You need other disciplines to tell you whether premises are true or false, and hence whether an argument is sound or unsound. So let's take stock. I told you that the main aim of logic was to distinguish good from bad reasoning. We now have a slightly more precise way of saying that. The main aim of logic is to distinguish valid from invalid arguments. So we've learned a lot of important definitions in this lesson. I suggest that you dedicate them to memory. The first key definition was that of an argument, which is a set of statements such that one member of that set, the conclusion, is affirmed on the basis of the others, the premises. Second, and most importantly, an argument is valid if and only if there is no possible way for all of its premises to be true when its conclusion is false. Third, an argument is sound if and only if it is valid and all of its premises are true. Thanks, and I'll see you at the next lesson.